Sandy Denny asked, "Who knows where the time goes?" Time answered by taking her life at 31 before anyone realized her voice would outlive them all. April 23rd, 1978. Queen Charlotte's Hospital, London. Sandy Denny had been in a coma for 4 days. She was 31 years old, the voice that had been called the greatest in British folk music, the voice that had graced recordings by Fairport Convention and Led Zeppelin, the voice that had asked where time goes. That voice was silent now, and it would never speak again. The official story was straightforward. She'd fallen downstairs at a friend's house on April 17th, hit her head, lost consciousness, never woke up, a tragic accident. But accidents don't happen in vacuums. The fall was real, but what led to the fall? The alcohol dependency that had worsened over years, the prescription medications that interacted dangerously, the deteriorating health that made her unsteady. Those weren't accidents. Those were symptoms of an illness that had been consuming her slowly. An illness the music industry was poorly equipped to recognize or treat. Her husband, Trevor Lucas, sat by her bedside, holding a hand that couldn't squeeze back. Their daughter, Georgia, was just 18 months old, too young to understand why her mother wouldn't wake up, too young to remember the voice that would define her mother's legacy. The machines breathed for someone whose own breath had become unreliable long before the fall. When Sandy died on April 21st, the obituaries were brief. Folk singer dies at 31. Most of the world outside folk circles didn't know who she was, didn't understand what had been lost. The music she'd created, revolutionary, beautiful, defining an entire genre, existed on recordings that most people had never heard. She'd been one of the greatest voices of her generation, and she died in near obscurity, her talent recognized by connoisseurs but unknown to the masses. But here's what Sandy couldn't have known as she lay dying. Time would prove kinder to her music than to her life. Her voice, preserved on recordings, would outlive her body by decades. Future generations would discover those albums and wonder how anyone that talented could have been so overlooked. Her signature song about time's passage would become a standard, covered by countless artists, its question echoing through decades. Who knows where the time goes? She died believing she'd failed, that her career was over, that she'd never fulfill her potential. She died not knowing she was already immortal. The tragedy isn't just that Sandy Denny died young. The tragedy is that she died not knowing her voice would never die at all. To understand how a voice that ethereal ended up silenced so soon, we must go back to the beginning, to a girl in suburban London who wanted only to sing. Wimbledon, London, 1947. Alexandra Aline McLean Denny was born on January 6th into a comfortable middle-class family. Her father, Neil, was a film editor for the BBC. Her mother, Edna, a former nurse who'd left her profession to raise children. This was post-war Britain, rebuilding itself from rubble, finding normalcy after years of war. The Dennys lived in a pleasant house in a respectable neighborhood, the kind of place where children took piano lessons and parents had ambitions of university and professional careers for their offspring. Sandy, she'd always been Sandy, never the formal Alexandra, was a quiet, bookish child. She read poetry, taught herself guitar, sang along to records in her bedroom. Her voice, even as a child, had an unusual quality. Something pure and aching, like hearing someone sing from another room and not being quite sure if they were real or imagined. When she sang at school events, teachers noticed. When she sang at home, her parents smiled indulgently. The way parents do when children show talent that's nice but not particularly useful. They encouraged her music as a hobby. The way middle-class families do. Good for character, nice to have accomplishments, but not something to build a life around. When Sandy finished school, her parents steered her toward nursing. Practical, respectable, secure employment. A proper career for a young woman. Sandy enrolled in nursing school in 1965, attempting to become the daughter her parents envisioned. But nursing school was wrong in every possible way. The clinical efficiency of hospitals, the focus on bodies as machines rather than humans as souls. It felt like betrayal of everything Sandy believed in. She lasted barely a year before dropping out. This wasn't her path. Her path involved music, even if she couldn't articulate exactly what that meant, even if her parents were disappointed, even if it seemed impractical and uncertain. Could a shy nursing school dropout from Wimbledon have imagined she would help define British folk rock? Or was she simply following the only path that felt true? In 1966, 19-year-old Sandy began singing at folk clubs around London. The folk revival was flourishing. Young people rediscovering traditional songs, American folk crossing the Atlantic, a sense that music could be authentic and meaningful in ways commercial pop wasn't. Sandy fit perfectly into this world. Her voice was made for folk music, clear and pure with a vibrato that could make simple melodies heartbreaking. She sang at Les Cousins in Soho, at the Troubadour in Earl's Court, at any venue that would let her perform. She wasn't chasing fame or money. Those seemed impossibly distant. She performed because singing made sense in ways nothing else did. When she sang, she was home. Everything else felt strange, foreign, like wearing clothes that didn't fit. But on stage, with her guitar and her voice, she was exactly where she belonged. She lived cheaply in shared flats, worked odd jobs, devoted every spare moment to music. Her parents worried. This wasn't a proper career, wasn't secure, wasn't what they'd envisioned. But Sandy was discovering something fundamental about herself. She couldn't be happy doing anything except music. It wasn't even a choice. It was simply what she was. By 1967, Sandy had become known in London's folk scene as a singer with exceptional gifts. When the folk rock band The Strawbs needed a vocalist, they recruited her. She recorded songs with them that showcased her range and emotional depth. More importantly, she began learning how to be a professional musician, how to navigate recording studios, how to work with other musicians at a high level. But the real transformation came in 1968 when Fairport Convention, Britain's premier folk rock band, lost their female vocalist. Fairport was doing something unprecedented, electrifying traditional British folk music, adding rock instrumentation while maintaining emotional authenticity. They needed a singer who could handle both traditional material and experimental impulses, someone with a voice powerful enough to cut through electric guitars but nuanced enough for delicate ballads. They found Sandy Denny, and Sandy found the musical family she'd been searching for. Joining Fairport Convention in 1968 changed everything. The band members, Richard Thompson on guitar, Ashley Hutchings on bass, Simon Nicole on guitar, Martin Lamble on drums, were brilliant musicians and kindred spirits who cared about music with the same intensity she did. With Fairport, Sandy didn't have to compromise or explain. She could simply sing, and they would build music around her voice that made it soar. The chemistry was immediate and undeniable. Richard Thompson was a guitar prodigy, his playing intricate and emotionally complex. Ashley Hutchings was a purist passionate about traditional British folk. Simon Nicol provided melodic counterpoint. Martin Lamble drove everything with drumming that could be delicate or thunderous as needed. And Sandy was the voice that tied it all together, the human element that made the experimentation feel grounded and real. Their collaboration was electric from the start. Sandy brought not just her voice but her songwriting. She'd been writing songs for years, intimate pieces about time and loss and love. Fairport gave her the platform and the musical sophistication to fully realize these compositions. Their first album together, What We Did on Our Holidays, showcased Sandy's range. She could handle traditional ballads with gravity, could bring pop sensibility to original songs, could shift from delicate to powerful within a single performance. But it was their third album together that would change British folk rock forever. The sessions for what would become Liege Lief took place in 1969, in the aftermath of the van crash that had killed Martin Lamble. The band was traumatized, grieving, uncertain whether they could or should continue. But music was the only language they had for processing what had happened, so they poured their grief into the recording. The album was called Liege Lief, and it centered on traditional British folk songs, murder ballads, love songs, stories that had been passed down for centuries. Fairport took these ancient songs and reimagined them with rock energy, creating something that honored tradition while pushing it into the future. Electric guitars wailed over traditional melodies, drum solos punctuated centuries-old verses, and at the center of it all was Sandy's voice, carrying these old stories with a gravity that made them feel urgent and contemporary. They recorded songs about battles and betrayals, about lovers separated by death, about the inexorable passage of time. Sandy approached each song as if she were channeling the ghosts of everyone who'd ever sung these melodies, giving voice to centuries of human experience. Her performance on traditional songs like Matty Groves and Tam Lin was transcendent. She didn't just sing the notes, she inhabited the narratives, made medieval stories feel as immediate as yesterday's news. But the album's emotional centerpiece was Sandy's own composition. She'd written it years earlier, a meditation on time and loss and the strange comfort of inevitability. The lyrics asked a question that had no answer. Who knows where the time goes? The song was deceptively simple in structure, voice, guitar, subtle accompaniment, but devastating in its execution. Sandy had refined it over years of performing it in folk clubs, had found exactly the right phrasing, the right emotional weight for each line. When Sandy sang it, her voice moved through the melody like water, sometimes gentle, sometimes urgent, always achingly beautiful. She sang about seasons changing and birds migrating and being unafraid of time's passage. But beneath the acceptance was something else, an awareness that time takes everything, that nothing stays, that all we can do is ask the question and live with never knowing the answer. The song would become her legacy, the piece of music that would ensure her name lived on decades after her death. But recording it in 1969, Sandy couldn't have known she was writing her own epitaph, couldn't have imagined people would hear prophecy in those lyrics decades later. Liege Lief was revolutionary. Critics called it the album that defined British folk rock, the template every subsequent artist would follow. Sandy's voice was recognized as something special, not just technically proficient, but emotionally authentic in ways that couldn't be taught or faked. She'd become, at 22, one of the most important voices in British music, but success brought pressures Sandy wasn't prepared for. Constant touring meant living on buses, sleeping in hotels, performing night after night in different cities. The adrenaline of performance made sleep difficult. The anxiety before shows made her nervous system scream. And like many musicians, she discovered that alcohol could quiet the anxiety, could make the constant motion bearable, could help her sleep after shows when her mind wouldn't stop racing. At first, it was just drinks after shows. Social lubrication. Nothing unusual in the music world where drinking was simply what musicians did. But gradually, imperceptibly, it became something more. A drink before shows to calm nerves, a drink to sleep, a drink to wake up. The line between musician who drinks and musician with a drinking problem is invisible until you've crossed it, and Sandy crossed it without realizing what was happening. Then came tragedy that would scar Fairport forever. In May 1969, returning from a gig, their van crashed. Martin Lamble, the drummer, was killed. Sandy's boyfriend Richard Thompson was injured. The band was devastated, traumatized, struggling to understand how to continue after losing someone so vital. They finished Liege Lief as a tribute to Martin, pouring their grief into the music. For Sandy, the crash was a wound that wouldn't heal. She'd lost friends before, but this was different. Sudden, violent, proof that everything could end without warning. The anxiety that had always been present got worse. The drinking increased. Music had been her refuge, but now even music was tainted with loss. Despite the trauma, Fairport Convention continued touring and recording. But Sandy was struggling. The drinking was becoming noticeable. Missed rehearsals, performances where she wasn't quite present, tension with bandmates who worried but didn't know how to help. In 1969, after barely a year and a half with the band that had made her famous, Sandy left Fairport Convention. The official reason was musical differences. The real reasons were more complicated. The pressure, the drinking, the inability to cope with constant touring, the sense that she needed to prove herself outside of Fairport's shadow. She formed her own band, Fotheringay, named after a traditional song about Mary Queen of Scots' execution. It was meant to be her chance to lead rather than follow, to prove she could succeed on her own terms. Fotheringay released one beautiful album that showcased Sandy's songwriting and vocals. Critics praised it. But the band fell apart within a year. Tensions over musical direction, financial pressures, and Sandy's increasing unreliability as her drinking worsened. Shows were canceled because she was too ill to perform. Recording sessions were disrupted. The talent was still there, brilliant and undeniable, but it was becoming buried under problems that were growing harder to ignore. By 1971, Sandy was attempting a solo career while her personal life spiraled. The alcohol dependency that had started as a way to cope with anxiety had become the central problem in her life. It affected her health. She gained weight. Her face became puffy. Her coordination suffered. It affected her career. Producers and promoters became wary of booking someone who might not show up or might show up too impaired to perform. It affected her relationships. Friends worried, offered help that wasn't taken, watched helplessly as someone they loved destroyed herself slowly. The music industry in the 1970s had no framework for treating addiction. Musicians drank and used drugs. That was simply part of the culture, almost expected behavior. The romantic myth of the tortured artist meant that self-destructive behavior was often seen as proof of authenticity, rather than as illness requiring treatment. The idea that someone might need medical intervention rather than moral judgment was barely acknowledged. Sandy's friends could see she was in trouble but had no idea how to help her beyond offering sympathy and hoping she'd somehow fix herself through willpower alone. What made Sandy's situation particularly tragic was that she was aware of the problem. She knew the drinking was destroying her career and her health. She made attempts to quit, would have periods of sobriety lasting weeks or even months, only to relapse when stress or anxiety became overwhelming. Each cycle of sobriety and relapse left her more damaged, physically weakened, emotionally devastated, increasingly hopeless about her ability to ever truly recover. Addiction is a chronic illness, but in the 1970s it was treated as a character flaw, and Sandy internalized that judgment, saw her inability to stay sober as personal failure rather than as a disease that required proper treatment. Yet somehow, even as her life deteriorated, Sandy continued making extraordinary music. She released solo albums that showcased her songwriting gifts and that voice, still capable of heartbreaking beauty even as the person behind it was breaking. Her 1971 album, The North Star, Grassman and the Ravens, was critically acclaimed, featuring intricate arrangements and sophisticated songwriting that proved she was far more than just a folk singer. Songs on the album explored themes of isolation, longing, and the search for meaning. Autobiographical elements she was either unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge directly. Her 1972 album, Sandy, showed even greater musical ambition, incorporating string sections and complex production. Critics praised her growth as an artist, her willingness to experiment while maintaining the emotional authenticity that had always defined her work. But the album sold modestly, failing to translate critical acclaim into commercial success. The folk audience found them too polished, too produced. The mainstream rock audience didn't know who she was. Sandy existed in a commercial limbo, too sophisticated for folk purists, too folky for rock audiences, unable to find the commercial breakthrough that might have given her career the stability she desperately needed. Then came the Led Zeppelin session in 1971. Robert Plant was a fan of Sandy's work with Fairport Convention and specifically requested her for a track on their fourth album. The song was called The Battle of Evermore, an apocalyptic folk rock epic that required a female voice to trade verses with Plant. Sandy arrived at the session nervous. This was Led Zeppelin, the biggest rock band in the world, and she was a folk singer whose albums sold in the thousands rather than millions. But when she began singing, something magical happened. Her voice interwove with Plant's perfectly, her clear, pure tone contrasting with his raw power. She approached the mystical lyrics with the same gravity she brought to traditional folk ballads, making the fantasy elements feel weighted with genuine emotion. Jimmy Page, producing the session, was impressed by her professionalism and her immediate understanding of what the song required. They recorded it quickly. Sandy was a professional, knew how to deliver a performance efficiently, and the result was one of Led Zeppelin's most distinctive tracks. The session should have been a career breakthrough. Led Zeppelin was huge, and being the only woman to ever sing on one of their albums should have raised Sandy's profile dramatically. But Led Zeppelin released albums without singles, relied on album sales and live performances rather than radio play. The Battle of Evermore was buried as a deep cut on the album. Most Led Zeppelin fans never knew who the female voice belonged to. The opportunity that should have made Sandy famous instead became another example of her talent being recognized by insiders but unknown to the masses who bought millions of Led Zeppelin records. Throughout the early 70s, Sandy released albums, toured sporadically, struggled to maintain anything resembling stability. Her weight fluctuated dramatically. Her performances became unpredictable, sometimes brilliant, sometimes nearly incoherent. Venues became reluctant to book her. Record labels became frustrated with an artist who was undeniably talented but increasingly unreliable. In 1973, Sandy married Trevor Lucas, an Australian folk musician she'd known for years. For a brief moment, it seemed like marriage might provide the stability she desperately needed. Trevor understood the music world, understood Sandy's talent, loved her despite and because of her complexities. They had a daughter, Georgia, born in 1977. Motherhood should have been an anchor, a reason to address the drinking that was destroying her health and career. But addiction doesn't respond to should. Despite loving her daughter, despite having a supportive husband, despite possessing one of the greatest voices in British music, Sandy couldn't stop. The alcohol had gone from being something she controlled to something that controlled her. She tried to quit, would have periods of sobriety, then relapse. Each cycle left her more damaged, physically, emotionally, professionally. By 1977, Sandy's career was essentially over. She could barely get bookings. Her health was deteriorating from years of heavy drinking, liver damage, weight gain, coordination problems. She'd gone from being the voice that defined British folk rock to being a cautionary tale, someone younger musicians were warned about. She was 30 years old and washed up, her talent recognized but her person destroyed. Friends who saw her in those final months described someone barely holding on. The vibrant, talented young woman who'd revolutionized British folk music had been replaced by someone who seemed hollowed out, going through motions of living without actually being present. The drinking had taken everything, her career, her health, her sense of self. All that remained was that voice, still capable of beauty when she could summon the focus to sing. On April 17, 1978, Sandy fell down a flight of stairs at a friend's house. Whether she was intoxicated at the time was never definitively established, but given her history, it seems likely that alcohol and prescription medications contributed to the fall. She hit her head severely enough to cause brain injury. She never regained consciousness. For 4 days, she lay in a coma while Trevor and friends kept vigil. The doctors weren't optimistic. The brain injury was severe, the damage extensive. On April 21st, with Trevor by her side, Sandy Denny died. She was 31 years old. Her daughter Georgia was 18 months old enough that she existed, young enough that she would have no memories of her mother. The obituaries were respectful but brief. Folk publications mourned the loss of one of the genre's great voices, but the mainstream press barely noticed. To most of the world, Sandy Denny was unknown. She'd revolutionized British folk rock, had created music that would influence generations, had possessed one of the century's great voices, and she died in near obscurity. Her talent recognized by aficionados but unknown to the masses who bought records by Led Zeppelin and Fleetwood Mac. Without knowing who Sandy Denny was or what she'd contributed, the funeral was small, attended by friends from the folk world who gathered to mourn someone they'd loved and couldn't save. They played her recordings, that voice, achingly beautiful, asking questions about time that now felt unbearably prophetic. They shared stories about her talent, her kindness, her struggles, and they wondered privately and together whether they could have done more, whether there was some moment where intervention might have changed the trajectory. Whether Sandy's death was inevitable or preventable, the truth is that addiction is an illness, not a moral failing. Sandy Denny didn't drink because she was weak or foolish or didn't love her daughter or didn't value her career. She drank because she had a disease that the music industry of the 1970s had no framework for recognizing or treating. She needed medical help, therapy, support structures that simply didn't exist. Instead, she got sympathy and judgment and people hoping she'd somehow fix herself through willpower alone. Could Sandy Denny have been saved? If she'd lived in an era with better understanding of addiction, better treatment options, less stigma around asking for help, would she have survived? These questions haunt the people who knew her, who loved her, who watched her destroy herself and didn't know how to stop it. But here's what makes the tragedy even more bitter. Sandy died believing she'd failed, that her career was over, that she'd wasted her talent and would be forgotten. She died not knowing that time, the very thing she'd sung about so hauntingly, would treat her music far more kindly than it had treated her life. In the years after Sandy's death, something unexpected happened. Her albums, which had sold modestly during her lifetime, began finding new audiences. Liege Lief was increasingly recognized as the album that had defined British folk rock, the template every subsequent folk artist would follow. Music historians and critics began reassessing her solo work, recognizing the sophistication of her songwriting and the emotional depth of her performances. And Who Knows Where the Time Goes, that haunting meditation on time's passage, became a standard covered by countless artists across genres, its question echoing through decades. Judy Collins had recorded a version in 1968 that became widely known in America. Nina Simone covered it. Fairport Convention continued performing it in concert, a tribute to the voice they'd lost. Each new version introduced Sandy's song to audiences who'd never heard her original recordings. The song transcended its creator, became part of the folk canon, a piece of music that felt ancient even though it had been written by a young woman in the 1960s. Young singers discovered Sandy's recordings in the 1980s and 1990s and marveled at that voice. So pure, so emotional, so capable of expressing depths of feeling that most singers couldn't access. Artists like Kate Bush and Alison Krauss cited Sandy as an influence. Robert Plant continued speaking about her talent in interviews, expressing regret that she'd never received the recognition she deserved during her lifetime. Richard Thompson, who'd played guitar on those revolutionary Fairport Convention albums, spoke about Sandy with a mixture of admiration and sadness, acknowledging that they'd all watched her struggle without knowing how to help. Music historians began recognizing her as one of the most important voices in British folk music. someone whose influence extended far beyond her limited commercial success. The woman who died in obscurity was becoming legendary, her name spoken with reverence by musicians and critics who understood what had been lost when she died at 31. In 1995, a 4-disc box set of Sandy's work was released, collecting her albums with Fairport Convention, Fathering Gay, and her solo career. The extensive liner notes told her story, the talent, the struggles, the tragic early death. For many listeners, it was their first introduction to Sandy Denny. They heard that voice asking where time goes and understood immediately why she was considered one of the greats. The box set sold well, introducing Sandy to a generation that had never heard her name. In 2011, a compilation album called Gold Dust was released, featuring reworked versions of Sandy's songs with new orchestral arrangements produced by her friend Trevor Lucas before his own death in 1989. The project had been Trevor's attempt to present Sandy's songs in the lush settings he felt they deserved, to demonstrate the sophistication of her songwriting. Released decades after both of their deaths, Gold Dust introduced Sandy's music to yet another generation. The album charted in the UK, reaching number 29, a level of commercial success she'd never achieved during her lifetime. Young singers discovered these recordings and were inspired to seek out Sandy's original versions. They found Liege Lief and understood why it was considered revolutionary. They found her solo albums and discovered songwriting that was deeply personal yet universally resonant. They heard her voice on the Battle of Evermore and finally knew who that haunting female voice on the Led Zeppelin track belonged to. The irony is almost unbearable. Sandy died believing she was forgotten, believing her career was over, believing she'd wasted her talent. But time, the very thing she'd asked about so hauntingly, proved kinder to her music than to her life. Her voice, preserved on recordings, outlived her body by decades. The woman who'd been unknown to most of the world when she died became a legend whose influence touched every folk and folk rock artist who came after her. Her daughter Georgia grew up without memories of her mother but surrounded by her mother's legacy. She heard stories about Sandy's talent, her kindness, her struggles. She listened to the recordings, that voice, her mother's voice, asking questions about time that Georgia would spend her life trying to answer. She learned that her mother had been extraordinary, had been troubled, had been human in ways that were both beautiful and tragic. Trevor Lucas, who'd held Sandy's hand as she died, spent the rest of his life, he died in 1989, dealing with the grief and guilt that comes from loving someone you couldn't save. He knew Sandy had been ill, knew addiction was a disease, knew intellectually that her death wasn't his failure. But knowing something intellectually doesn't make the heart believe it. The members of Fairport Convention who'd watched Sandy destroy herself after the van crash that had traumatized them all carried their own complicated grief. They'd seen her brilliance, seen her decline, been unable to help. They continued making music, some of them for decades, but they never forgot Sandy, never stopped missing what she'd brought to their music, never stopped wondering if there was something they could have done differently. Sandy Denny's legacy is complex. She was one of the greatest singers British folk music has ever produced. She was a gifted songwriter whose compositions have been covered by artists across genres. She was a pioneer who helped define British folk rock. She was also someone who struggled with addiction, who died tragically young, who never got to see how her music would endure and influence generations of musicians. Her story isn't about the romantic tragedy of the doomed artist. It's about talent wasted by an illness that wasn't treated, about a music industry that had no framework for helping someone who needed medical care, about the specific tragedy of dying too soon to know that your voice would live forever. The question Sandy asked, "Who knows where the time goes?" has become her epitaph. Time took her life at 31, but it couldn't take her voice. That voice still exists on recordings that continue finding new listeners, still capable of moving people to tears, still asking that same unanswerable question. When young singers discover Sandy Denny today, they hear something transcendent, a voice that could make simple melodies heartbreaking, that could carry emotional weight most singers couldn't approach, that sounded like it came from somewhere ancient and eternal. They hear music that seems impossible. How could someone so young have accessed such depths of feeling? How could someone create beauty that profound? What they're hearing is genius, pure, undeniable genius. But they're also hearing tragedy because that genius should have had decades more to develop and mature and create. Sandy Denny should have lived to be an elder stateswoman of British folk music. She should have seen her influence acknowledged during her lifetime. She should have held her granddaughter and known that her music would outlive her. Instead, she died at 31, believing she'd failed, never knowing she was already immortal. That's the cruelty of time. It takes everything, including the knowledge that sometimes the things it takes are the very things that will last forever. If one of the greatest voices of a generation can be lost to addiction and obscurity before anyone recognizes what they're losing, how many other geniuses are we failing to see, failing to help, failing to save before it's too late? Time took Sandy Denny's life, but it could not take her voice. That voice still asks us with every note, who knows where the time goes? And the answer, painful and beautiful, is that we don't know. We can't know. All we can do is listen to what was left behind and understand that some voices are too precious to lose. That addiction is an illness that requires treatment, not judgment. That the price of failing to help people who are suffering is measured in silences that should have been filled with music. Sandy Denny's voice is eternal. Her life was tragically brief, and the distance between those two truths is the space where all the music she never got to make still echoes, asking questions we'll never be able to answer.